the first question you're asking yourself, and you've got 15 amazing classes to choose from, which means it's not going to be easy. So I'm going to give you the rundown on all 15 classes so that hopefully you can come and your allies. You need to know, what class should I choose? That's probably the first question you're asking yourself, and you've got 15 amazing classes to choose from, which means it's not going to be easy. So I'm going to give you the rundown on all 15 classes so that hopefully you can confidently pick the perfect class for yourself. Let me start off by saying that all classes can do all content in the game, and all classes are great at doing AoE damage, though some make it easier than others. Also, when you get to the end game, groups will try not to bring duplicate classes because each class brings its own buffs and debuffs that don't stack. So if two sharpshooters are in the same group, only one of their buffs and debuffs will be counted. This helps promote class diversity in groups in the endgame, so pick a class that looks cool to you. As always, I can't stress enough how important it is to be excited about how your class looks and feels. Lost Ark released years ago in the East, and the West is reaping the benefits of those years of balancing that took place prior to our launch. So really, every class is capable as they've been tweaking them for years. As I talk about each class, I'll play footage of their abilities in the background so that you can not only listen to their strengths and weaknesses, but also look for something that visually excites you. Let's begin. First up, the warrior. These are your heavy armor wearing big boys. They specialize in staying close to the action and taking hits while dishing them back. If swords and heavy armor are your thing, start here. The first warrior class is the berserker. The berserker is a melee DPS who uses a two-handed greatsword and rocks that heavy armor. They are not as tanky as the other heavy armor classes to follow, but they are the most agile of the heavy armor classes. This results in them being really well-rounded, actually, with a nice blend of tanky and hard-hitting abilities that leaves the class being great for new players and veterans alike. While all classes do have AoE damage, the berserker has some of the best feeling AoE damage in the game. Their abilities in general are just as effective as everyone else's, but easier to line up and pull off due to the shape of their AoE cones. Due to the fact that they put out so much damage, they are necessarily a little bit squishier than the other warrior brethren. It can be easy to get caught up in all the damage you're putting out, so mind your position and avoid taking too much damage yourself. Your ultimate sends you into a rage mode that allows you to attack 20% faster and with a 30% increased crit rate. This makes the berserker a fantastic choice for any group as it will do an excellent job of bursting down bosses. On top of that, their buffs and debuffs make them great to have in the group as well. If you want to wield a giant two-handed sword that drags on the ground behind you as you walk, look no further than the berserker. Next, we've got the paladin. The paladin is a mixture of melee and medium range damage. It wears a one-handed sword and a book. The paladin is one of the two healer/support classes in the game. The paladin's skills can be broken down into two categories. The blue skills, which use its sword, are mostly melee DPS abilities. The other category is the gold skills, which uses the book and is used for support. For instance, you can activate a giant golden aura that increases your entire group's damage by 10% as long as they're standing within it. Some of your abilities have pretty lengthy cast time, so positioning will be critical to make sure you don't end up a dead pancake because you started casting the ability in the wrong place at the wrong time. The primary purpose of the paladin in a group is as the healer support character, and for this reason will be one of the harder classes to play in the game. As with all supports, you are expected to watch not only yourself but your allies. On top of that, you are expected to know the boss mechanics so that you know when it is and is not a good time to dish out those buffs and debuffs. If you're looking for the feeling of a mage in heavy armor or to be a heavy armor healer, then the paladin is going to be the pick for you. But remember that later on in group content, you will be expected to play as a support, opting for group buffs over self buffs to better enhance your party. Next up, we have the gun lancer. The gun lancer wields a gun lance. It's basically a melee gun, and as such will have you constantly seated on the front line of every battle, which is precisely where you want to be on this class. If you want to play it tank, then the gun lancer is the class for you. This is the tankiest of the tanky and considered the one tank in Lost Ark. The gun lancer features things you would expect from a tank, such as the ability to taunt enemies, and excels at absorbing and mitigating damage for both itself and its allies. Of course, the drawback to being this tanky is that you will move slower than the other classes. Your movements will need to be more deliberate as you can't easily recover from finding yourself out of position. It's really important to note that just because you are tanky doesn't mean you aren't putting out amazing damage. Actually, gun lancer's damage is pretty close to being on par with the rest of the DPS. They simply just aren't able to move around as much. Expect to plant your feet and unload on bosses as you stand toe to toe with them. Gun lancers can have a massive impact on a fight as they can make a fight a lot easier through their positioning and their damage absorption for the group. You can even taunt bosses to interrupt their abilities. This is where being a gun lancer can be more difficult than other classes, as you are expected to mind both yourself and your allies. You need to know mechanics and how to avoid or mitigate the damage from those mechanics for both yourself and your group. If you want to be a tank main, this is the class for you. The next category of classes are the martial artists. The martial artists are quick, hard-hitting classes that excel in getting in, dealing damage, and getting out. Being quick is not just something they can do, it's something they have to do, as standing in damage will result in their quick demise. The first martial artist is the War Dancer, a melee DPS wearing fist weapons, one of the fastest and most mobile classes in the game. It has shorter cooldowns and has more mobility, but is significantly more squishy than the other classes. The War Dancer is highly valued for its buff, which grants crit chance and attack speed to the allies, making it a great addition to any group. In fact, War Dancers offer some of the best group support of any DPS. Due to the War Dancer's squishy nature, positioning and general awareness of raid mechanics will be important, as will knowing when and when not to go in for the strike. Getting caught out of position is oftentimes fatal for this glass cannon, but when played right can be incredibly rewarding. The next martial artist is the Striker. If ever there was an MMO class pulled straight out of Street Fighter, it's going to be the Striker. The Striker is the male version of the War Dancer that preceded it here on this list, so it's going to share a lot of the same descriptions, pros, and cons. It's a martial artist and it feels exactly like you would expect it to, but with a lot more flair than you're used to seeing a martial artist have in a video game. Again, being a martial artist means you'll have great mobility, but also be quite squishy in return. It's going to be a fantastic group member as it's got those buffs and debuffs we talked about with the War Dancer. If you love the War Dancer or any of the other martial artists, but you wish you could be a male, then the Striker is for you. Next up, we have the Scrapper. The Scrapper is a melee DPS wearing fist weapons yet again. The Scrapper is a slower, harder hitting version of the War Dancer. By this I mean that the abilities hit harder and feel more impactful, but it can very easily get you caught in bad spots as you get locked into skill animations. Due to its slower, less mobile nature, it is also a bit tankier than the War Dancer and Striker, making it perhaps the most well-rounded martial artist. It dishes out damage really well, but also takes it fairly well too. Due to its well-rounded nature, it does really well in both PvP and PvE. The Scrapper has two resources and you will constantly be using one to fill the other. Use your yellow resource abilities to charge the green meter and use the green resource abilities to charge the yellow meter. Once you master balancing your chi, this class becomes incredibly satisfying. Scrappers excel at staggering enemies as well as buffing their allies to help them stagger enemies, which is incredibly useful for group content. If you want to be a bruiser that gets up close and pummels the enemies, the Scrapper could be the choice for you. Next up, we have the Solfist, which is one of the more unique options in the game. The Solfist is both a melee and a ranged DPS due to the fact that it's a martial artist, but also has a number of abilities with great range. This allows the Solfist to do well in more situations with less risk as they can keep their distance and continue dishing out damage when necessary. If you can't decide if you want to be melee or ranged, this is a fantastic option for you. And you can't talk about the Solfist without talking about DBZ. This class has Goku vibes written all over it. You've got the Kamehameha ability where you can shoot out energy at your opponents, blasting them from range. And as an ultimate, you can pull off Goku's Spirit Bomb move. This ability takes a while to cast, but it also is perhaps the single hardest hitting ability in the game. If you manage to land this on someone in PvP, they would be lucky to survive. Due to the fact that the Solfist has a fantastic burst window through the use of their ultimate, they are a great choice for PvP. The Solfist ultimate will reduce cooldowns and increase their damage and has you looking a lot like you just went Super Saiyan. If you want to be melee, but you also want to be magic, or maybe you just want to go Super Saiyan and drop Spirit Bombs, well then the Solfist is the class for you. The next category of classes is known as the Gunner. Gunners are your ranged DPS that specialize in projectile weapons. Sometimes the projectile is a rocket and sometimes it's an arrow. Sometimes they're fast and sometimes they're slow. There's a lot of diversity in this category to say the least, so let's talk about each one. First up, the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger carries 2 pistols, a shotgun, and a sniper rifle. That is a total of 3 different weapons you'll be cycling through. You will use each weapon when it's appropriate for the distance you're standing from the enemy. When using the pistol and the shotgun, you'll want to be closer, and when using your sniper rifle, you can be far away. Where the Gunslinger shines, however, is its ability to play the game at range, as their sniper rifle abilities perform really well compared to their counterparts, which we'll talk about in a moment. As a Gunslinger, you will often have to move to and from your target, and fortunately, you will have a lot of mobility to facilitate this process. It will likely take some time to get used to switching between the 3 weapons, which means that the learning curve for the Gunslinger is higher than most of the other classes. If being the dominant sniper in the room sounds good to you, then you may want to consider the Gunslinger. The next class is the Deadeye. The Deadeye is the gender counterpart to the Gunslinger, and just like the Gunslinger, it carries 2 pistols, a shotgun, and a sniper rifle. So once again, you will be choosing your weapon based on your distance from the enemy, oftentimes moving to or from your enemy to unload certain abilities. While the Gunslinger excels with the sniper rifle, the Deadeye excels with the shotguns, which means the Deadeye will need to spend more time closer to the enemy than the Gunslinger. Once again, this class has a higher learning curve due to the fact that you're not only using your abilities like everybody else, but you're also switching between 3 different weapons in the process. If you love shotguns, this is definitely the class for you. Next up, the Artillerist. Yes, this is one of the most unique MMO classes I've ever seen. Their weapon of choice is this artillery weapon that can change between being a gun and a flamethrower and even a rocket launcher. This thing feels like a medium range version of a berserker. You've got a giant weapon and moderate mobility, but you also have an almost unparalleled level of animation locks. Playing an artillerist will mean you need to be constantly looking ahead in the battle and where your enemy's going to be, not right now, but moments from now, as your animations can be really lengthy. Because of how hard it can oftentimes be to land your attacks with this class, you are heavily rewarded when you do. For the same reason, many of your attacks have enormous AoE radius. If you are looking for a slower, more methodical playstyle with fewer but harder hitting attacks, the artillerist might be the perfect class for you. And remember, when you completely miss one of your attacks because the boss moved, be sure to laugh. This way I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing with you. Next up, the sharpshooter. The sharpshooter is Lost Ark's bow class, or a ranger. It excels in both range and mobility, but as a result, it is incredibly squishy. If you really enjoy being able to kite your enemies and completely avoid damage, you'll enjoy the playstyle that the sharpshooter brings. The sharpshooter also has a pet hawk that follows them around and helps them out. This class will be the only class that can hide at launch, which combined with its amazing range will be incredibly useful in PvP. Thanks to the glass cannon nature of this class, positioning will be key, so always be mindful of your surroundings and where you need to be next. Fortunately, you have a lot of mobility at your disposal to aid in this endeavor. Legolas mains who prefer to stand at the back of the fight and unload bow damage from range, this is the class for you. Next up, we have the mages. The mages are just that, casters of magic. There are two of them at launch and they couldn't be more different, with the bard being your support and the sorceress unleashing unmatched elemental fury. First, let's talk about the bards. Bards wield a harp and cast what feels like very magical abilities at the enemies. Bards are one of the 3 support classes that will be included in the game at launch, filling a similar role to the paladin. While bards can put out decent damage, they excel in their ability to keep their team alive, and this is why they will always be one of the most desired classes to bring in any raid. But for the same reason, your group will expect you to be that fantastic support they need. Your damage will often be secondary to the buffs and support you'll be providing for the group. In turn, this means that you'll once again not only be responsible for yourself and your own damage, but also for your team, making the bard one of the hardest classes to play effectively in Lost Ark. A couple of examples of bard buffs include a buff that increases group attack speed and another that reduces their damage taken. Before you choose to main the bard, make sure to listen to some of the bard gameplay or even try it out for yourself, as it tends to be very hit and miss for players. You will be hearing constant musical notes, which can be beautiful to some and distracting to others. So if you enjoy a musical class with beautiful abilities, or if you enjoy being needed and sought after in group play, the bard might just be the class for you. Next, we have the sorceress. The sorceress wields a staff and uses the elements to unload damage on their enemies. Each of the sorceress's elements kind of have their own utility. They use fire to drop big AoE damage, as well as damage over time on their enemies. The sorceress also uses ice to slow and freeze their enemies, and then finally they use lightning to damage and stun their enemies. The sorceress is the truest caster in the game and represents the mage archetype really well. As for PvP, the sorceress has excellent CC capabilities and can be great for saving allies. If you enjoy epic, flashy, hard-hitting abilities and more of a glass cannon playstyle, then the sorceress is the choice for you. And finally, we have the assassin, which feels a lot like the martial artist, but with sharp melee weapons instead of fist weapons. They are quick and excel at getting in and out of combat as a necessity. So let's dive in. First, the Shadow Hunter. The Shadow Hunter is a melee DPS, but it has some incredibly surprising and powerful mid-range reach on some of its abilities. The Shadow Hunter is a high mobility, fast-paced class, and as a result can be on the squishier side of things. Essentially, this class is one with the demonic side of things in Lost Ark, granting it the ability to go full evil and use that in its mission to eliminate its enemies. Similar to the Berserk in its ability to easily land lots of large AoE abilities, but doing so faster and getting out faster to make sure it avoids taking too much damage for too long. As with all of the squishier classes, it's going to be important to be mindful of mechanics, as it can easily spell your end if you eat too many of them. Next, we have the Deathblade. The Deathblade is kind of like a martial artist that dual wields swords. It brings fantastic buffs to the group, such as an attack speed buff and a damage buff. These two buffs make them a fantastic addition to any raid group. As is the case with all assassin classes to this point, it has fantastic mobility and great attack speed. Similarly, it's going to be quite squishy as a result, which means you will need to be focused on knowing when to get in and out of combat to set up your attacks and minimize your risk. If you enjoy fast-paced, up-close glass cannon gameplay that can be high risk and high reward, the Deathblade could be the choice for you. And that's all 15 classes in Lost Ark. You've got the Gun Lancer as the go-to tank option. You've got the Bard and the Paladin as the always desired supports. And then all of the other classes fall into various levels of DPS mains, each bringing their own unique buff and debuff to the group. Which class are you leaning towards, and will you be making alts? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, consider liking and subscribing for more Lost Ark content. If you ever want to hang out with someone else who loves MMOs, be sure to swing by my stream over at twitch.tv/luckyghost. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.